Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Susan Linder, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show, where we try to bring the best innovators and storytellers together to give you the best ideas on how to tell better stories to get the resources, the runway, and the recognition you deserve for your amazing idea. It's not often that I delve into the academic world and for our innovation discussions. And why is that? Because most of my audience tells me that the folks who are big in the ivory towers don't really know necessarily what's going on at the boardroom. And to that, I say, no. There are some professors that are deeply, deeply embedded in corporate life and the understanding how organizations function and how innovation functions inside of organizations as well. And that's why I'm really excited to have Roland Deiser here with me today. He is not only a phenomenal professor, but also has done a lot of heavy lifting around bringing networks and communities together to think about the future of work, to think about digitalization, and of course, our favorite topic, innovation. And so let me tell you a little bit about Roland before we dive in. Roland Deiser is passionate about understanding transformational challenges and the political dynamics of large organizations and business ecosystems. And he pursues this interest by publishing, teaching, speaking, advising, orchestrating executive peer networks, and even producing custom think tanks. He just loves to explore the boundaries at play and at the edge. And these are the places of discourse and innovation and life for all of us. After 10 years as a senior fellow with USC's Annenberg Center for Digital Future, Roland founded the Center for the Future of Organization at the Drucker School of Management back in 2015, where they focus on the challenges of organizing in the 21st century. The latest project explores the organizational capabilities required for business ecosystem leadership, and we're going to get into that a little bit more today. Roland works as an advisor to Fortune 500 companies, just like yours, government organization, and emerging companies, both in Europe and the US. He is also the founder and chairman of the Executive Corporate Learning Forum, ECLF, if you know it by that name, a consortium of more than 60 multinational corporations from 14 countries who have teamed up to share practices and explore how to develop strategic and organizational capabilities in very fast changing environments. And that's why Professor Deiser is on the call with us today. So welcome, Herr
Thank you.
Professor Deiser. Dankeschön. Thank you for joining
Thank you,
me.
Susan. What an introduction. Oh, wow. That was very kind of you. Thank you so much.
Well, it is my pleasure and really very grateful to have you on the show today because so many times, and just a shout out also to our friends at Innovators and Hans Ballmakers, who introduced me to you and learning more about your work. If you don't know the Innovators community, that's Innovators with an 8 in the middle of it. They're based out of Amsterdam, but run globally and do amazing work at bringing together chief innovation officers and folks who have innovation as their part of their job description to talk and understand and share best practices and giant mistakes with each other so that we can all learn and move ahead faster. So shout out to Innovators. Thank you for introducing us. I'm excited to have you here because I do think there's a lot of skepticism what academics can teach corporates about innovation, organization, and change. Can you help me dispel this myth that actually this academic rigor does help with large organizations?
Well, maybe I'm the worst guy to ask that because I have my issues with the academic ivory tower, right? I always call myself, or actually, we even host a kind of a series of roundtables, which I call ABC, academia, business, and consulting. And I think you need really these three worlds, in my opinion, right? So I think academia has this big advantage that they got to be paid to think, right? I mean, they do this all the time. They read books, they write books, and do things like that. But the price they pay is they get to be remote from practice, many of them, right? And then executives, obviously, they get paid, they will create their bottom line and top line and perform their organizations. So sometimes they don't have that much time to reflect, think, sit back and reflect just. what strategy could be, what long-term things are. The consultants are the C somehow in the middle, right? I mean, they are immersed in companies, but they don't get really their feet wet other than issuing invoices. But, the
Ouch,
responsibility at
that
the end of
hurts.
the
That
day,
hurts this consultant
I
right
know,
here.
but that's the truth, right? The immersiveness when it comes to implementation, many consultancies, just provide advice, but they don't have really that much skin in the game. So I think the advantage of those, of course, is they see so many companies, right? Which the academics usually don't. And so I think the threesome of academia, business, and consulting is interesting to bring together. So myself, I tried also in my own life, in my career, to straddle between those three worlds, right? So I went into venture development. I did work within the corporation way back with Daimler, where I created their corporate university, and I've been in academia since actually my student times, teaching and writing books and things like that.
So, and I think the data that academics can produce, right, is sometimes very valuable. What a McKinsey can offer, right? You're looking at things perhaps with a far more skeptical rather than paid for eye as well.
Yeah, that's true. You get that kind of quote unquote objectivity. It's not markety, right? Many of those research reports that you get from consultancies obviously are an indirect soft power to brand them and things like that. So academia really, with rigor and all these kind of things. The only issue I have with rigor is if you look at Academy of Management papers and things like that, they're extremely remote from practice. They are really written for the community of academics, right? There is actually research how many people read research papers, right? And in the Academy of Management, which is the AAA journal of the profession, I think the average readership is 8, right?
Oh my God.
So, yeah, you write an article, you push it through 2 years of peer review, right? And then 8 people read it, and probably half of them are some PhD students who need it for their own paper that again gets read by 8 people. And that's kind of a sad thing. I think what drove me, because you were, I think, asking before, what drove me towards this work that I do and connecting, let's say, theory with practice or thought leadership with practice leadership is really getting an impact in organizations and having something actionable that comes out of it. I think it's the same thing with learning. If you don't act on your learning, it's a mind exercise, to use a euphemistic word.
Oh yeah, that well said for my audience. Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about networks, because much of my show is about dispelling the myth that any one individual is solely responsible for innovation. You may have the idea in the middle of the night, but more likely our innovation is what Napoleon Hill referred to as the result of synthetic imagination. So it is a constant pulling apart and bringing together new ideas that we hear all over the place and synthesizing old ideas with new applications. So in doing so, bringing more minds together brings more battery power to the brain trust. And you've been really a wonder and at the forefront of bringing together innovation coalitions to really begin thinking about problem solving, whether it's around the workforce and the organization or around innovation itself. Can you tell us a little bit about how you embarked on this process and what some of the byproducts of that work have been?
So maybe 2 different things, right? One is networks that bring together peers. So what we did way back, and it came really out of my work at Daimler, putting together like-minded individuals who have a similar context that they're facing and which is challenging, difficult, political, and so on and so forth. The other thing when you talk about ideation, being a social activity, it's also that if you innovate in a company, you cannot do it alone. If your idea is alone, it doesn't get any traction. So you have to have a highly sophisticated social and political strategy almost, right? Or skills in order to make an innovation gain momentum, right? And get legs in an organization. That's a different type of network, right? So you need the networks within your organization, within your business ecosystem you're immersed in, which are really the stakeholders you've got to work and you've got to engage. That is one element of networking. The other thing of networking is what I did with the ECLF, for instance, with the consortium we're just about to launch, which maybe we'll get about to talk in during that podcast as well, is really saying, well, we share experiences, and the peer-to-peer sharing of experiences leads us, first of all, to the feeling we're not alone in all that, right? That's mentally important, right? Because sometimes people feel alone in their organizations, and if they have peers where they can share things, that's actually a consoling kind of thing. The other thing is that together, working across boundaries of an organization, so you bring together people from different companies, allows you to get perspectives that you don't get within your own company. We know that innovation happens, of course, at boundaries these days. May it be cognitive boundaries, may it be industry boundaries, may it be also just organizational boundaries and collaborating with others. Innovation doesn't happen in a kind of a vacuum. And so if you design boundaries nicely, and creating these corporate networks is one way to bring people across boundaries into conversation, you automatically instigate an innovative conversation and process. So this is another element of that. But if you want, I can talk how I got to that, because you wanted to have a story on that, right? So my own story is
And not only
exactly,
that, not only the
yeah,
story of how you started
okay,
it,
all
but
right.
how did you get other people to join it? Because
Well,
there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of
right.
ego. Tell us a little bit about that, the story that you told to get
So
into this.
it was in a way, yeah, maybe serendipity, I don't know, but it was also born out of my own aspiration, to be honest, right? So I came to the United States in 94. I worked at that time on the academically and also in the consulting world on the convergence of strategy processes and organizational learning, which was a hip thing at that time. So looking at strategy as a capability issue, not so much as a planning issue, and wrote a paper about that, which got on the desk of the CEO of Daimler back then. And he said, well, you writing about transformational learning architectures. We had back then GE famously in the mid-90s with Crotonville, their workout programs, which were paradigmatic as a transformational, innovative organizational learning architecture. He said, let's do something like that in Europe. And I did. I went there, gave up my life in Hollywood for a while, and went for a project, quote unquote, to Europe. First, we, as an advisor, more or less helped to design this a little bit, but then also took on an executive role. And it was a big shock, because it's, as I said before, you don't have the skin in the game as a consultant or as an academic. You get the ear of the CEO, that's all nice. The moment you move into the political realm of an organization, things become very different. You've got stakeholders who have their territories, you have political processes, and all the nice conceptual frameworks that you have to implement them is not so easy. So what I did, and back then I was a lot on the speaker circuit because it was the first corporate university of Europe, right? So others came and followed suit, right? Siemens and many other companies, primarily in Europe, because it was based there. And on the speaking circuit, we talked and said, hey, how are you doing? I've got these glossy slides, how great we are, right?
Mhm.
But our harsh reality is very different, right? I'm supposed to show great slides because that's what you actually should do as an executive that represents an organization. But if you are really looking what's going on in your life, it's a tough work to get things done, especially if they're change oriented, innovation oriented, transformation oriented. And then the other guy said, well, guess what? Same thing. I show these great slides, but my reality is also not easy and difficult. And I said, why don't we just get together as a group of companies? It started out with the DAX companies, the large Germany, because Daimler was in Germany. It later became international and grew into many, many countries. And we said, let's get together and share how things really are and not how we see at the slide decks at conferences. We also kept it vendor free. You asked for success factors. We kept it totally vendor free. So no business schools. We wanted to sell, of course, executive programs, no consultancies. Because one issue you have, and I think it's very important doing these things, is you have to curate such a community very well. You have to make sure it's got a certain kind of seniority. It's got a certain kind of really shared issues that are not exploited by people who, it's legitimate, of course, to have consultants, vendors, they're important element, but it changes the conversation. The moment you have a vendor in the room, the conversation changes, right? Because people say, well, I share now some vulnerability. Tomorrow I have a proposal on my desk. that's not really what I was in for, right? So it was about curating my, I would say, big specific context back then. An advantage was I myself was in one of the most recognized back then organizations and companies at that time. So it was easy to attract others. And once you have a few really big names like Siemens, and we had Shell, and so large Fortune 100 or 500 companies, then it was not so hard to get others attached to this. So that's more or less how it started.
And how did you, by excluding some people and inviting others, what were you hoping when you first launched it was going to be the outcome? What was your mindset in saying like we desperately need this because, and what we hope to produce out of this is?
So I came into this, of course, from my old academic background or thought leadership, if I may say so, background of the articles we've written about strategy and organizational learning. And if you move then into the space of corporate learning, it is hidden, not hidden, it's positioned within HR in the learning and development department. And I always had this ambition to show actually learning is much, much more than educating people in trainings. It's really designing a transformational architecture. And that is a stretch, by the way, until today, which has not been solved, right? We still, there is a lot of literature and activity, especially now with technology going on in this space of learning, and everybody gives lip service to the importance. But we see the moment learning becomes something that is transformational, that really drives organizational and even strategic innovation, which in my book, learning is about, then you get the people stand up and say, hey, I'm strategy. Hey, I'm innovation. Hey, I'm IT. And you need all these stakeholders. And how do you really get them together? That is not easy. So my thing always was, my constituencies in that network were heads of corporate universities to say, hey, guys, you got to have that stretch to really move the practice from A to B. And in the last 20 years, it hasn't moved that much, I have to admit, though, unfortunately. So I personally then went more into the work future of organization. It's more of organizational design and strategic innovation and things like that, which are different constituencies. But that was the motivation, and always driven by making an impact, drive something from A to B, make some change happen, making organizations more, how should I say, almost emancipated, right? Knowing what they do, being sustainable, being responsible, being really citizens in this world that contribute not only in the spirit of Peter Drucker and now the Drucker School. You've got a kind of a social and political responsibility also as an organization. It's not just about Wall Street.
That ethos, right, of bringing people together in this way is unusual once you get inside the corporate walls, right? Well, none of us are innovating on our own, even within the innovation suite, right? For the chief innovation officer and his or her team. But inevitably, if you're going to do this well, you have to get everybody involved, right? You have to get lots of hands involved in. That's why I have these concentric circles around me, because you come up with a great idea and then it needs to expand to the other teams that actually have to execute, because the innovation team is that, right?
Yeah, so now we're talking about the network within an organization, right? Which
Right.
is kind of a different ballgame. So this one was a self-help group, if you may say so, that eventually evolved into a corporate kind of network that addressed key issues of the practice of corporate learning. Now, I've got a little bit myself almost tired of the old problems of learning and development. We're actually just reinventing this community, going towards more leadership and transformation and ecosystem leadership. But if you look then at the networking necessities within an organization, you talk about a chief innovation officer with his or her team, right? You talk about how can you make things from an idea to possibly incubate and eventually scale and really create a breakthrough organization. That is a conundrum which also has been discussed forever. I remember I have an old slide from 95 about ambidexterity, right? How to create the future while high perform in the present. And that is the innovation dilemma, right? You have to perform still in the present, but also design ideas for future. That's a transformational thing. The only helper, if you may say so, are technological primarily, but also sometimes political or regulatory discontinuities that force you in a way to think differently. Think about what generative AI right now does for innovation, right? It's something that happened in many organizations outside the organization. Suddenly they're faced with something that puts innovation pressure on them. So there are these enablers. They come from technology, from global geopolitical dynamics. If China does certain things and we change our policy towards China, you got to maybe innovate your supply chain and other kind of things. But at the other end, there is also these guys who have great ideas. A friend of mine, Andy Binns, I don't know, Andy, he wrote that book, Corporate Explorer. And the Corporate
No, sounds
Explorer,
great.
yes, it's really an interesting concept. It's the guy who has these great ideas within an organization. And how does this explorer now make these ideas happen and get alliances and followership for these ideas, and eventually gets momentum and gets budgets and gets people and resources, and eventually really does something beyond just, let's say, incubation, right? Most of innovation we see, by the way, speaking of these three elements, ideation, incubation, and scaling, is really theater. Another friend of mine who runs the corporate VC, he used to be at Bosch and is now at Man Hummel. And we recently, by the way, did ourselves the roundtable on innovating innovation, right? Where we had these guys there. He says, innovation theater. You do hackathons, you do, I don't know, it comes out of the design thinking, Shark Tank, so whatever you do. Yeah, oh, let's get the ideas flowing. And people are briefly excited, a 2-day offsite maybe, ideas flow, tons of post-it sticky notes on the walls, but nothing happens, right? And it's actually almost demotivating rather than motivating in the organization, because they say, well, we had all these ideas, what's happening with these ideas, right? So innovation is very much a organizational, and also, how should I say, it's a multifunctional issue. It's very much also based on your social and political acumen in order to really start to engage other people. And it's not about convincing them. It's not about so much about that. It's creating traction through making, of course, the point, right? Making the business case for it. And in my opinion, what helps a lot if you start with a customer, right? And you don't start inside. Most innovation organizations, or many, let's put it that way, are still in R&D and are used historically to develop ideas and throw them over this fence and hope they stick in the market. And marketing should make sure that the market somehow gets interested in them. Now we have technologies where people and customers specifically can co-create, right? Where you have an ecosystem approach that drives actually from the outside in, and that triggers innovative processes rather than just being stuck within the boundaries of your organization. So the moment you open up, and we've got, of course, through cloud technology and all kinds of other things now, the opportunity to really deal with the outside very differently than we used to be in the past. This is also a big innovation supporter and driver. And getting a key customer, an important account, as an ally in an innovation idea might be more important as just getting some internal guy, right? So it's kind of a collaborative thing across boundaries. That's what I say always.
And where do you think having these external peer networks, right, that you get to bring folks in from large organizations, where do you think the communications snafus are? Where are people screwing up how they're talking about innovation when they go back to their desks, when they go back to their people after having this wonderful networking experience with their fellow peers? Where do you think they don't get the communications right?
I don't know if it's just a communications issue. We did quite a few years ago. I brought 20 companies from Europe to the Silicon Valley for a so-called learning expedition, right? And it was the time when Google was
You
still
took them to the
exciting.
zoo. You took them to the zoo, Roland. The innovation.
Zoo, but we were not. Yeah, it was zooey sometimes. Went to Google. That was certainly an idea. Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a zoo. But we also had, for instance, back then, I remember we got the entire board, the executive board of Cisco, having a full day conversation with
Wow.
our 20 people. And Cisco opened very much up and said, we had this kind of horizontal team-based organization, which didn't really work out. Now we have to introduce new leadership. It was a real exchange, which was great. And people said, wow, as you said, that was really interesting. But what they also said is, yeah, they can do it in the Silicon Valley, but if I go home to my company, I don't say any names right now, but it won't work in our context, right? So one thing is communication, but the other thing is also context recognition. And there is never a copy paste you can do, right? So you see things in an organization and say, wow, that's a great idea. Great. Best example, workout at GE. I don't know how many in the audience are familiar with the workout processes that
I was
Jack
in
Welch
that.
had back then. Oh, no, we're
I
in
was,
that.
yeah,
No
yeah, because
kidding.
I was doing workshops and trainings in Crotonville at GE.
Did.
Yeah, and so that was just a
You know.
phenomenal experience to be at the first ever learning university inside
Yeah.
of a corporation. It was
Yes,
a
exactly.
phenomenal experience. And
Yeah,
shout out to the
exactly.
learning and development team at GE, the originals who to help
The
build that to what it
originals,
was.
right? I mean, much has
Yeah.
happened as we know since, but back then everybody was it was a pilgrimage of companies to GE to benchmark, right?
Yep.
And I remember Steve Kerr back then was the chief learning officer. He toured it with a friend. Let's go. And in this one company, large, also global, multi-100,000 people company, all the top executives, 200, a full day. Oh, what do they do at GE? Now, at the
Mhm.
end of the day, said, well, it doesn't work with us, right? So the contextualization is very, very important. Now, if you think about things like people go to the innovators conference, they hear maybe an interesting speaker, they hear maybe a practice, an example. How did this company do that, right? How did this other company do that? Now let's get home and say, hey, Walmart does it this way or Google does it that way. It's not about how people do it. It's about how you really read the context in which you are. And there is no context which is the same. Every company is different. And it's the history of the company, it's the players, is it family, there are investors involved, there are stakeholders, and you need to understand the stakeholder ecosystem. And if you don't, you will in a way, I won't say fail, but it's really an uphill battle if you try without understanding context to do certain kind of ideas and things. And that's more, how should I say, it's really a social artistry, social and political skills. And we spoke about learning, right? I mean, we talk about learning always, oh, skill, upskilling, reskilling, maybe cognitive stuff, and now let's use AI. AI won't help you in your political and socially context management, right? You may maybe learn and better what others do. You can summarize maybe what they have published and things like that. But in order to shape the system in which you are, you need skills which are fundamentally human skills.
It's true. Yeah. We can't escape those no matter how much AI or how many robots that we
You
work
cannot
with.
escape
Right.
them. Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And now with AI, we don't want to talk too much about AI here, but it's really reshaping a lot of work processes and industries, right? From biology. I mean, there's applications now almost everywhere, and it's growing every day. It's exponentially learning more by itself, the technology, but it meets a social and political system which is really not prepared for that, right? So we're struggling in a way with that kind of bringing together, on one hand, the exponential technology development with the very linear, if at all, social and political skill development, right? So the abstract that is developing is biting us on the emotional side, the social side.
Yeah. As you think about this next, I know you're convening a new group now,
Mhm.
Roland. Tell us a little bit about why you're doing this now and what are some of the challenges that you think innovation leaders or innovative leaders in general are
Yeah.
facing that you're convening a new peer group?
Yeah. So maybe just the two things to that. So our work at the Center for the Future of Organization, the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, starting with digital transformation capabilities, and then especially the last 3 years on business ecosystem capabilities. So how do you really succeed in your business ecosystem engagement. There's been a lot of talk about ecosystems in the past few years. It's a hot issue. It still is. AI has overtaken it a little bit, but it still is. So we developed a kind of a framework to understand those capabilities, a 9-dimensional framework, which is strategy, organization, and most importantly, relationship management. And we got a lot of kind of interested response from the business community saying, well, hey, we recognize looking at these capability frameworks that we are maybe good in our partnership management, but in our resources management, how we capitalize, for instance, on the resources of an ecosystem, or on dealing with the mindset of people who are still very organization is inward oriented and doesn't really manage our boundaries well. But we said there's so many issues people share in a way that it makes sense to make a similar thing as we did with the learning back then. Say, let's bring together senior executives who really want to leverage ecosystems as an innovation, as a business development instrument, as something also to transform their organization. And let's share the issues we have. Let's identify key things that we may be able, by sharing our experiences, not solve necessarily, but maybe have various ideas how to address these things. And the second thing, what we want to do with that is use that community as a source for jointly engaging in consortium research projects. So now the academic comes back, right? I say, let's put together, instead of one guy paying 500K or $1 million, if we have 15 companies, then you can do a lot. Everybody just paying 30,000, but you can do a real nice research on key issues companies face. So that's the second thing, going into shared consortium initiatives with this consortium. And I say, why the ecosystem kind of thing and how it relates to innovation. If you go into an ecosystem strategy, you're forced to transcend your boundaries. You have to open your organization to engage with stakeholders outside, maybe supply chain, customers, regulators, competitors, whatever it is. That opening up really impacts the way you organize, because you cannot do the traditional 21st century organization of top-down and command and control, because an ecosystem work is emphatically horizontal, connected, and requires certain kind of semi-autonomy, at least peripheral organizations. So responsibility moves to the boundary where the business happens, where the customers are, and away from the headquarters corporates, right? I don't know if your audience has many large corporates, but the larger the corporate, all corporate, the larger the corporates, the harder it is, right? For instance, we're going to invite in the consortium, speaking about curation, C-level executives and maybe C-1 people who are in ecosystems, could be business development strategy and so on and so forth, but not from the corporate headquarters. I mean, we try to go into a size where you are closer to the customer, i.e. business units, for instance, right? So it will be business unit, also strategists. And obviously you will have to engage corporate at some point, because the moment a business unit engages in a new ecosystem strategy, corporate comes with its rules and regulations and all kinds of things, and you need to mitigate that. And you need to have an enabling kind of infrastructure that corporate eventually provides to do that. But where the action is with the customer, is at the periphery of the organization, and that's where we're targeting the whole thing. So, in a nutshell.
I think about, there are some folks who are innovation leaders, but who themselves have scientific backgrounds, right? Who are in very technical places. And while tasked with creating value, they're still very inspired by the science going on at the electron level, at the level of the...
No, and that is super important. That is super important. I mean, if we speak about ecosystems, we never talk too much about that, but universities, research labs, all that kind of stuff are very, very important stakeholders in a business ecosystem. It's not just the customers and suppliers, right? So, but most large organizations, I assume, will have their university relationship departments that deal with research labs and things like that. But again, also in research, you can fall back into very fundamental research, like a Max Planck Institute would do, right? Or that is funded typically by a government because companies won't fund that kind of fundamental research. And then it needs to travel eventually to that applied solutions that really translate into products, services, and new software architecture, whatever it is. And that is an interesting journey also to follow. And if you are an innovator, I think you really need to look along the whole, let's call it the value chain of research innovation, right? Which starts with very basic stuff. And we know, I mean, the great example of Park, for instance, way back, right, of Xerox's Park, none of these inventions or innovations made it really to the market through Xerox. It was always other people who commercialized it. And I don't remember exactly where it was. There was an article once even about those stages where innovative ideas move from one universe to the next universe and eventually get commercialized, right? Famously, of course, Apple took some of the graphic interface and other kind of stuff out of the lab. Xerox was unable to commercialize it, and there's a reason for that.
Right, the mouse, right? I mean, even the mouse.
Yeah, the mouse, the laser printer, a graphic interface, the PC. I mean, a lot of stuff, right? The same is true for the Bell Labs, right? I mean, you look at those corporate labs, but other people are running with it. And there's a reason for that. I mean, we don't probably have the time to go into this, but there's a reason for this, why fundamental innovators cannot really make money with it.
Well, and not only that, but the trajectory of corporate spinoffs in the day. I mean, this was like so new to even think about from a corporate structure standpoint, right? Thinking about, oh, I'm suddenly going to run a mouse division at Xerox. Oh, I'm suddenly going to run I mean, we just didn't even have the corporate mindset to think about spinning off companies like they were children back in the day, right? So even that kind of mindset and thinking was different. But the other part about that, I was just watching this beautiful documentary called General Magic. I don't know if you're familiar with the company, but absolutely brilliant. General Magic was a company that started 15 years before the launch of the iPhone. And it was all the components of the iPhone built into one unit that far superior than the Palm Pilot and before the Palm Pilot. And it never took off. It had a consortium of Sony and what would become Verizon and all of the biggest communications players that were going to help make it happen. But there were so many competing interests that were all held together by this tiny little startup that had $1 bajillion in funding. And the innovators inside just kept creating, I don't know, more icons, more emojis, more things like that were fun and interesting and exciting. But actually getting all of these players to work together and talk together and make it run was agonizing.
Impossible. But you know,
but every one of those co-founders of that company, or the engineers, even the interns, wound up becoming CEOs of companies that generated bazillions of dollars. To all of my audience, I strongly
have to look at that. I have to look into that.
Yeah, General Magic is on YouTube for free. I can't stop talking about it. So
no, that's really interesting. But think about Sony and why Sony did not invent, or they did not succeed with eventually the iPod, right? The iPod was not done by Sony. Sony was in the miniature business. They had the Walkman, they had the music division. You could think, wow, why don't they do the iPod? And because the music division was thinking in the way a traditional music publisher thinks, right? They didn't want to give up on the CD where you put on 9 songs nobody wants, but for the one song everybody wants, you sell the whole CD. They didn't want to disassemble, right? The songs, which actually then the iPod did, right? And we ended up with iTunes and all these kind of things. Sony could have done a huge thing here, but they didn't. And all those, the famous blockbuster Netflix, right? I mean, twice I heard they were twice offered the opportunity to buy Netflix, but they passed. It doesn't fit into our business model, right? It's
forget Blockbuster, right? We all know about that.
That's what I mean, Blockbuster, Netflix, right? Yeah. And so on. So these examples, I mean, people can't hear that anymore about Kodak and Netflix and all these kind of things and Blockbuster, but these are the issues, right? a mindset, and the brightest minds. I mean, Xerox PARC was led back then by John C.D. Brown, who was also the chief scientist of Xerox, one of the most brilliant people I ever met, and is a close friend of mine, and I admire his thinking. And not coincidentally, by the way, John C.D. Brown delved deep into anthropology, organizational learning, organizational politics, and things like that, because he understood learning that way, right? Lots of papers from JSB about learning, because he knew that innovation without understanding anthropology, political science, all these liberal things that are not numbers, but are the messy thing of people in social context, are so decisive as a key success factor to make innovation happen. And he couldn't do it within Xerox, right? It just couldn't. So
Yeah. And that's why anthropologists matter. I just want to give a shout out to all my fellow anthropologists
absolutely.
there.
Yeah, me too. If they're out there, I love them. They're really important.
Yes. Um,
Undervalued and underestimated.
keep saying it, Roland, because us anthropoligists need all the help we can get.
Yeah, I didn't know you're an anthropologist. Yeah, no, I think it's really social anthropology is a very important thing to understand what's going on in organizations and between organizations. So
Amen. Well, if you need an anthropologist in your consortium, you just let me know.
good to know.
And I know a network of anthropologists because those are the folks that are in my network. So great. Okay. So is there anything else you want to tell us about this group that you're setting up now that my listeners
No,
can
but so
keep an eye out
we're
for?
really just about to launch it. We've waited way too long to do that because we did a global survey maybe a year ago, and we got almost 100 people expressing interest in so much around things that we never really followed up. So that's more the academic procrastination, I guess. But so we're launching now. Probably it's a series of first meetings of interested people that are really just the design that everybody shares this current context and the questions and challenges they have, and then identify key themes we would like to follow up. And we follow them up through dialogues, through internal events, workshops, and also research projects. And we want to keep those groups small. If, let's say, 50 people really would be interested, we will split them up in these initial groups into groups of 15, max 20, because I think you need an intimacy of at least no more than one Zoom screen, a screen, so to say, right? But actually, ideally, something like 15 is a good number. Because think about it, you have an hour. How much time does everybody get if you have an hour?
Right.
If you're 50 people, nothing's happening. Half of them stay mute, right? So that's not what it is. It's about engagement very much. Getting back to your thing, by the way, about networks, it's all about having them engage, right? Letting them do the work, not work for them, right? Encourage them to do the work themselves. So, like the best customer strategies, let the customer do the work, right? And let him pay for that, that he does the work.
And I think I'm going to leave it there and going to let my audience think about them doing the work. But I am going to ask you the 3 questions I ask everyone who joins me on the podcast. Question number 1 is, what is the greatest innovation of all time?
Oh, you call me, you catch me a little bit.
Yeah, I'm putting you on the hot seat. What do you think? What is the greatest innovation of all time?
Well, I mean, of course, you could say these things like fire or the wheel, or maybe in the Industrial Revolution, the technology that came there.
Choose
I would
yours.
say if we took a little bit more recent, it's definitely the internet that changed so much. It led to social media, which is now really changing societies, and but it's actually a threat to democracy and all these kinds of things. It enables so many things. It made us everybody authors of ourselves and sharing that with all the good and the bad that comes with that. And you could then say, well, maybe the invention was the semiconductor, the circuit. I mean, everything that leads eventually to enable then these kind of technologies, it's a staircase, right? One after the other step you do. But if internet is maybe a good one.
That's a fine one, because we're always about dispelling the myth of the individual innovator. If you could join any innovation team through history, which team would you want to join?
Innovation team. I probably don't want to join them. I was just thinking of Oppenheimer, but I'm not going to join these. But that was a major innovation team, right? I mean, if
For
you look
sure.
at the movie, that was very interesting. Well, a hard time thinking about that. I think personally that the park guys at a certain time when the heydays of park, it was an exciting time there.
Mm.
Speaking of park from before, not
Yeah.
today, but back then, yeah.
Yeah. And lastly, what's something that annoys you or for the good of humanity, you simply just wished it existed? What is an innovation you would love to see in the world today that doesn't exist right now?
And I'm traveling a lot. I'd love to have teleportation.
Mm.
I read these science fiction books way back. It was actually really Pulp Fiction, but in there were the guys always teleporting all the time. So that would be really convenient, not sitting and, by the way, polluting and so on and so forth, because I go to Europe a lot. It would be
Yeah.
cool. I think about it and boom, I'm there. So that would be a cool innovation.
I couldn't agree with you more. Going to the airport used to be a luxury. Now it's become one of the most annoying things on the
Absolutely,
planet.
right? And I'd love to be able to afford private, but then it's unethical even. So, or not good for the planet. Hard things, hard
Hard
choices.
things. Well, Herr Professor Roland Deiser, muchas, I was going to say muchas gracias. Dankeschön. We're
Well,
people of
you
the
are my
world.
new favorite anthropologist. I didn't know. You are absolutely
Oh,
are.
that makes me so happy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
No,
And
my
if people
pleasure.
and if
And
people want to
yeah,
get
thanks.
yeah, Roland, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So the best way is really our website, which is futureorg.org. Lots of stuff on there. You also can download publications. There are tons of the videos because we also have not a regular podcast, but we do roundtables. We do kind of stuff. And by the way, if you do the podcast, we're probably going to put it on there as well, then yours for everybody to see. And then, of course, LinkedIn as always. And you find stuff that I do there. Yeah, and everybody's welcome to email me at roland.deiser@futureorg.org.
Wunderbar. Thank you so much for joining me today, Roland. I really appreciate it.
Susan, and thanks for a great conversation. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, take care.